Hello again. I'm Colin Lambert with Lambert Creative Media. So grateful you've taken a few minutes to be with us today live. Sorry we're a little behind schedule, but technology, when you do the live stuff, live is what you get. And had a little bit of a challenge getting started, but we're here. Grateful if you're here. Want to encourage you if you join live to get engaged, ask questions, make comments, and if you join in listening later, love for you to make comments as well. Would be glad to follow up on those. You might have had a chance to view some recent videos that I've done on my YouTube page for Lambert Creative Media. It's called Insights for Innovators. That's not what we're doing today, though our guest today is certainly an innovator. Those are special programs talking about specifically the art of creativity, of art, of music, those kinds of things. But I'm also wanting to continue to have conversations with people who are making a difference in others' lives, who are making a difference in culture, and who are addressing life and faith and culture. And so, boy, what better way to start than my guest today? And, I wanted to keep it simple, non-controversial, no big challenges on the fort. Yeah, we're going to talk about sexuality, faith, and culture with one of my favorite guests on the topic, and that is Dr. Juli Slattery. She is a clinical psychologist, an author, a speaker, president, and co-founder of Authentic Intimacy. And it's just so great to have her with me today. Juli, great to have you here on the program. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your time so much.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be with you, Colin.
Let's just start with a little bit of your journey. How did you end up finding this line of work? What got you into the clinical psychology?
Well, I think early on, as an early adult college student, I had a passion for helping people understand how the Bible integrates into daily life, which is really a biblical understanding of psychology. How do I read the scripture and also see the wisdom of God as it applies to my depression, my marriage, parenting, navigating the challenges of loss in life? And so that was sort of the trajectory of my passion early on. And then, as I think a lot of us know, you go to school, you study, but then you really don't know what you're called to until you get into the real world. So just counseling with people and teaching and just kind of evolved from there.
And how did you begin to find yourself in the area of focusing on sexuality beyond just general counseling?
Yeah, in the work that I did as a clinical psychologist, of course, you're going to deal with issues around sexuality, whether it be from a marriage perspective or trauma recovery. We're all sexual people. We all carry different levels of sexual brokenness and questions. So certainly I was exposed to that as a clinician, but it wasn't until about 10 or 11 years ago that God really put a call on my heart, just burdened my heart for the topic of sexuality and just how we really weren't speaking into the confusion and pain that the average person was wading through related to sexuality, particularly within the church. And so about a decade ago is when I started the ministry Authentic Intimacy, and I've been devoted to studying and teaching biblical sexuality ever since.
I still remember the times when this began, when the whole process began with Authentic Intimacy, and boy, it has just grown so much and gone so far and impacted so many people. And I want to talk about a number of those things, but before we get to some of those specifics down the line, talk for just a moment about what is Authentic Intimacy, what's it designed to do, how does it intersect people's lives?
Well, our mission is reclaiming God's design for sexuality. And that's a very broad mission because sexuality uh, touches on so many different aspects of who we are, of what's happening in our culture, what's happening in our families, what's happening in our own personal lives. And so it begins with this idea of how do we even understand God's heart for sexuality? And then what does it look like to navigate different areas of brokenness? The ministry started 10 years ago as a ministry to women. And so for the first 7 or 8 years, I was writing and speaking exclusively to women. And then God began to just open up doors for men to join that conversation. So at this point, we create resources, including a podcast, books and studies, events, webinars around all issues related to sexuality. And we also do a fair amount of work now training Christian leaders. How do we address sexuality with a gospel perspective, not just a behavioral management perspective, but really knowing the heart of God for whatever issue you might be addressing, whether it be LGBTQ questions or brokenness in marriage, infidelity, pornography, sexual abuse recovery. So I tell our team, hey, you're never going to be bored. There's a lot of pain, and God's truth is adequate to addressing our pain. And so that's what we hope to do through everything God has given us to do through authentic intimacy.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about how you feel like the church is doing today dealing with this issue. You've mentioned that, there was a need for more
Mm.
conversation about these kinds of things in the church. How do you think the church is doing today, and how has that changed maybe over the 10 years you've been doing your work?
Yeah, it has changed quite a bit. I would say in the beginning, we had difficulty even getting into a lot of churches because they would say, we don't talk about that, or our women don't struggle with those issues. And we really have transitioned from a silence perspective, or at least like a guarded conversation about sexuality, to living in a world where every Christian leader, every church knows that these issues are pressing for the people that attend that church. And so the conversations have opened up a lot. I would say where we're still lagging behind is we have a problem solving mentality towards sexual issues instead of a reclaiming perspective. And what I mean by that is, you remember like the carnival game, the whack-a-mole, where you just try to, hit the one that is right there. And I think a lot of churches feel that way, like, oh no, how do we address pornography? How do we address, the crisis of teenage girls who want to change their gender? We have all these people in our churches that are experiencing infidelity. And so we're trying to solve the problems without realizing that the problems are a symptom of the fact that the enemy really owns this territory in our hearts and in our thinking. We want to help churches move to from that defensive problem solving perspective to an offensive. How do we invite God to really inhabit this aspect of our lives and our humanity, and reclaim the ground that for so many of us the enemy has just camped out in?
You mentioned being able to impact people's lives through this work and obviously through the church. One of the things that I did as we were kind of setting up the program today, I put a description on this video, and it says, inside and outside the church, issues of sexuality and faith are swirling around us, encouraging people to join the conversation as we take an honest, reasoned, and straightforward look at some of the challenges facing men, women, boys, and girls. I want to pause just a moment, and yeah, this is certainly anecdotal, but you deal with a lot of people through a lot of channels. Could we go through each one of those categories: men, women, boys, girls? What seems to be affecting each one of those groups the most at this point, or maybe something that stands out to you and something we should be paying attention to related to that? Let's start with men. What are you hearing from men or about men that the church and others, each of us, need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think for men, the most obvious issue is pornography, not just pornography use, but the impact that pornography has on the wiring of the brain, even. So, some of the research would show, for example, that a lot of men in their 20s or 30s who are getting married, and this includes Christian men, are actually unable to enjoy sex with their wives because their brains have been wired to respond to unrealistic expectations of pornography. And so that would be a primary issue that I think the vast majority of men are dealing with at one level or another. And certainly there's others. I hate to stereotype, one in every six men have experienced childhood sexual trauma. And so often we talk about that as a woman's issue, but it certainly impacts an awful lot of men as well. So, but I would say the chief thing that men are coming to a ministry like ours for help with would be around sexual integrity, pornography. How do I enjoy sex in marriage in a healthy way?
How about women? What would you say for grown women, some of the challenges they're facing today?
Yeah. Again, it's so hard to boil it down because I'm sorry, I have dogs barking at my neighbors. So if you forgive me for that. But if you look at it, women are struggling with pornography too. a lot of women are struggling with, I can't enjoy sex within marriage. There are a lot of single women, Christian single women, who are saying, I'm in my 30s. I've been waiting for God to bring a spouse, but there's no spouse. What is the purpose of my sexuality? And that leads to all kinds of issues about identity and temptation. And so women are really looking for help on those kinds of questions. You've got the sexual trauma. So also there, with 1 in 4 women having experienced childhood sexual trauma. So it's really, Colin, hard to boil it down to one thing. There's just pain. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of questioning the goodness of God because of the pain that sexuality has brought into a lot of women's lives in one way or another.
What about boys and girls? These are areas that I'm just so concerned about today, and you
Mhm,
hear so much in the news. Just in the last few days, I've seen books that are being published for 4-year-olds that are
mhm.
talking about graphic sexual things. You mentioned pornography, issues of identity. I don't know if it's accurate. I've seen some reports out of California saying that almost 1 in 4 young people now are questioning their gender. So for boys, young girls up to maybe teenagers, again, I know you can't be super specific, but just maybe in general that and what other things, or how would you describe some of those challenges?
Boy, you've hit on it. We've really seen in the last 5 years this dramatic shift from us thinking about sexuality as something that we do to thinking about it as something that we are. And so sexuality has become a primary identity marker for this generation of young people. And as we see in the news, this is being reinforced by what's infiltrated into media and educational systems, where an essential part of what it means to be human is being able to define what gender you are, who you're attracted to, and it's viewed as harmful or hurtful for us to bring any form of objective truth into that. And because that philosophy has changed so rapidly, we do have 4 and 5 year olds, but particularly like 12, 13, 14-year-olds going through this massive change of, I think the latest research I saw was 1 in 5 Gen Z identify as LGBTQ. We've never seen stats like that before. And we have a culture who's saying that is a good thing. We need to promote that. We need to encourage it even at the youngest ages. And so there really is a worldview shift that we certainly saw the threads of 20 or 30 years ago, but we're seeing the fruit of today with this generation of young people. And parents and youth pastors feel very ill-equipped because they've never dealt with these kinds of questions. Their kids are bringing home situations and questions that we never even thought of a few years ago. And so my heart goes out to parents. I'm a parent as well, and leaders who love these kids and don't know how do I even begin to combat the thinking that is being fed to the youngest of our children.
I'm going to come back to church and parents in just a moment, but as a doctor, as a clinical psychologist, are you concerned? Are you amazed at how the medical community has so quickly, it seems quickly, both psychologists, psychiatrists, and medical doctors have jumped on this idea of allowing young people to begin to transition or to make really strong changes with either surgery or medication before they're even 18. We don't let them go to war till they're 18. We don't let
Yeah.
them drink till they're 21. We don't let them drive till they're 16. Yet they can make these kind of decisions at this age. Does that concern you? And are you surprised by the rapid nature of these changes?
Mhm. Well, yes, I'm concerned. I'm really concerned, and I'm not the only one. Although we see this progression in medical fields and certainly psychiatry and psychology, not everyone in those fields is on board. There are some that are raising concerns and saying, hey, let's even wait and look at the data. Do these kinds of interventions even help? We know that these kids are experiencing depression or anxiety. We know there's a problem, but is the solution helping or is it making things worse? And these changes are so new that there's very little data or research to say we're helping or we're hurting. And so I think we'll see, and we're already starting to see bubbles of it, but I think we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years as this plays out that, oh, wow, there are people that aren't God fearing, that aren't coming from a religious perspective, but are looking at data and saying the depression rates are going up, the suicide rates are going up, the anxiety rates are going up. Maybe we need to change our strategy. Am I surprised? Not really, because when you change your worldview, and when you move from the worldview of there's a creator, there's an objective truth that we're called to seek and really surrender to a God who created us for his purpose, you have to replace that with something. You have to find another way of identifying and defining what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to flourish. And this is the narrative of our day, that to be human and to flourish and to live happily in any way, you have to have freedom from external constraint. And so the theory behind it, the narrative behind it, the worldly philosophy behind it makes sense. And I've met people and understand that people think they are really doing good by getting rid of external constraints like gender or biological sex, getting rid of external constraints like rules around healthy sexuality. So there's a logic behind it that makes sense if you don't start with the fact that we have a creator who has defined sex and gender for a purpose. So I see how we got there, but it's still deeply concerning.
So if you start with that place with parents and the church, let's just hit both of those quickly as our time is running short today. The church, where does a church start? Maybe they've never had these kind of conversations. How do you recommend that a church begin to have some of these important conversations, or at least find a way to engage parents in the process?
Yeah, I think churches need to start at the highest level of the discussion. I think the temptation for many churches is to hit the issues. So they start doing a sermon series on LGBT, or they do a sermon series on how bad pornography is. Those aren't wrong, but I think it's addressing the problem before we set the table as to why God cares about our sexuality. Most Christians do not understand the biblical narrative of why our sexuality matters in the first place. And if we don't know the heart of God, why this is such sacred territory and such a spiritual battle, it feels legalistic or judgmental to talk about rules. And so, our recommendation for churches and organizations is grapple with the why and tell the story of the Bible and sex. Why did God create sexuality? Why is it such a contested spiritual battlefield in all of our lives? And then we can begin working on how does this play out in your life and really provide help there. So that's my best recommendation. Again, going from a problem solving mode to let's reclaim the narrative of God's heart for us and sexuality.
Yeah, and for parents, I mean, there can be a flip out factor these days. Just
Yeah,
even hearing a child mention some of these topics, oftentimes a parent doesn't even know where to go. Obviously, I would assume that you would encourage parents to be doing the same thing, teaching those godly principles of sexuality from the earliest days. But a parent maybe who's facing a challenge from a young person, or those words maybe you never want to hear, gay, trans, something else,
yeah.
how might they respond?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that this is a journey. Parenting is a journey. Even if you have adult children, it's still a journey. And so I really love to encourage parents to think about a term that I started using a few years ago, sexual discipleship. We talk about sex education, but how do we disciple our kids sexually? And discipleship is a journey where there's highs and lows. And our kids will wander from God and they'll seek God, and God will call them back. And so really invest in that long-term journey. Another piece of it is you can only disciple your kids as far as you yourself have gone. And so for a lot of parents, it means I need to understand God's heart for sexuality. I need to deal with my brokenness, because we will be hesitant in jumping into this conversation if we don't really have a sense that God is redeeming me, he's healing me. And so that's where we start with a lot of parents. And then discipleship happens from the overflow of our own lives.
Well, it's an incredibly challenging topic, and I knew we would not be able to get to everything today. But I want to honor your time and your engagement with me today. I pray we can have some further conversations down the line related to this. Maybe go into some specific topics and talk more deeply, answer some questions, and so forth. But I really wanted to lay a groundwork today for the kinds of things that parents should be thinking about, that churches should be thinking about, and each of us individually be thinking about related to what God's plan is and sexuality. You've touched on that. We'll go deeper into that another time. But Dr. Juli Slattery, so grateful for your ministry, for your work, for your ongoing commitment to this issue. And folks can find you at AuthenticIntimacy.com. We'll again connect people here in just a moment. But so grateful for you and your ministry and all your team. Give my best to all of them. And thank you again for your time today.
Well, thanks so much, Colin. It's a joy to be with you.
Dr. Juli Slattery, again, the ministry is AuthenticIntimacy.com, AuthenticIntimacy.com. There are books there. There are Bible studies. They do conferences. They engage with churches, with parents. There are so many ways to get engaged. And again, I could just kind of scratch the surface today because there's just a limited time to engage with folks on these issues. But I want to come back. We'll do it again. We'll have some other topics as well. I'm already scheduling some other guests to talk about life and faith. And I hope you'll be a part of it here with Lambert Creative Media. Just be looking for details. The big way to do that is subscribe. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lambert Creative Media. Subscribe. Hit that little bell. That will give you notices when there's a program coming up like today. And I want to encourage you to do that as you can. Also, it helps if you share and like the video. If you're getting something from it, I encourage you to like it. And of course, share it with someone that may need to hear it. Even today, someone who might be struggling with one of the issues that we were talking about, just them seeing the website for Authentic Intimacy might connect them with somebody that can help them take the next step in their spiritual journey. So I want to encourage you to share that as well. So subscribe to Lambert Creative Media, like and share as you can. I'm Colin Lambert, Lambert Creative Media. Thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it. God bless you, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.